Okay, so you can see the Pironman enclosure right here. I've gone ahead and put it together. All the parts came out of this box, which right now is empty. There's a number of parts that are left over. So these are spare parts, things like spacers, for example, a few additional screws, and a couple of tools that I'll show you in a moment, plus an extra ribbon cable, which is used to connect the Raspberry Pi GPIO port, which is up here. So there's my Raspberry Pi, there's the GPIO port, and then through this ribbon cable, you can connect it to the daughter board so that the GPIOs are exposed to the outside of the box so that you can use the GPIOs. I'm going to open up the side of the parent box to show you inside and also talk about a couple of gotchas that I noticed as I was assembling the case. So I'll start first with the spare components. So it's a really nice thing to see that Sunfounder added a few extras. So first of all, there's the tools. So you don't really need any additional tools. So you can use these tools to tighten up the spacers. A screwdriver matches all the screws that you'll need. There's a thermal pad. The enclosure comes with a huge cooling tower. You can see it here. Cooling tower plus a fan on the other side that attaches to the board and to the enclosure, and then the cooling tower can fit well on the Raspberry Pi's processor using thermal pads. I didn't use all of them, just a few extras here as well. There's a few extras, screws, bolts, and spacers. So if you lose any of those items as you are assembling the enclosure, there are a few spares, which is really nice. Apart from that, the instructions for the assembly are really nicely laid out. So it's a color leaflet here with step-by-step instructions, very easy to follow. I didn't really get stuck anywhere. If you are concentrating on the task, you just need about an hour to put it all together without racing. So it's just one little thing that I noticed that I'm going to mention in a moment when I remove one of the side covers of the enclosure. I wanted to mention just to save you a little bit of time. But other than that, it's all easy to follow. Nothing complicated with the enclosure and its assembly. Okay, let's have a look at the enclosure itself. First of all, the Raspberry Pi. So here in the middle is the Raspberry Pi. On the bottom side is the daughter board that contains a socket for an SSD. I'm going to show you that in a moment. And then the connectors for things such as the fan, the LEDs. You can see the LED, perhaps you can see it right there. It's on the top of the enclosure. It creates a nice ambient light. There is the fan that is attached right onto the acrylic side cover and just pushes air through the cooling tower. You have access to the Raspberry Pi input outputs. So there's the power USB-C type input, the audio, and then the HDMI 1 and 2. On the back here, you've got access to your USB ports. Now, this component here is a bridge module. It connects one of the USB ports to the SSD port down here. And this way, you can actually use a much higher capacity SSD, which you can see right here. I've installed a 128 gigabyte SSD instead of the SD card that's built into the Raspberry Pi. However, if you prefer to use an SD card, you can still do so. You can see there's a micro SD card slot right here because the actual SD card slot of the Raspberry Pi is inaccessible once your Raspberry Pi is inside the box. So that plugs in there and you still get access to the other ports, especially the Ethernet port. And there's an alternative power input socket here. So you can either use this input power or this. All right, now another couple of items to notice is the on-off switch. This switch is multi-purpose. It allows you to turn your Raspberry Pi off. Of course, it allows you to turn it on, and you also can press it in order to activate the screen. The screen, you can configure it to turn off automatically after about 30 or 60 seconds. That time is configurable. It's a screensaver. If you want to see the status of your Raspberry Pi, you can just press the button momentarily and it will turn on. And there's also an infrared receiver right there. Okay, so that's it. Now I'm going to open up the case. Probably going to open it up on this side just to show you a couple of things inside. So let's do this. I'm going to fast forward this bit. All right. So this, I can just, there's 2 more screws right there. These screws, they are to secure the cooling tower. So just need to remove those as well. Everything is really made with precision, so there's nothing really loose. The tolerances are quite tight. It's really well made, right? Yeah, okay. So there's the side cover, and now you can see, take a better view of the cooling tower. The Raspberry Pi right there, this is a Raspberry Pi 4, and its ports, and the daughter board right there. Now, as you can probably see here on the daughter board, I'm just going to move the case a little bit to the side here. You see there's a few more RGB LEDs. So there's one of them. So those are used to create an additional ambience, I guess. Plus the LED strip, RGB LED strip up the top of the case. I'm going to remove one more panel, that's the bottom panel, so that you can take a better look at the SSD that is attached to the bottom of the enclosure. So I removed this screw here, the spacer on the inside as well. There's a spacer here that also got removed. So let's just put that back in. And while I'm holding the spacer so that it doesn't move, I've removed that last screw. And there are also 2 last screws on the side. Okay, and there's the bottom panel of. Right, so here's the SSD that I was talking about, 128 gigabytes. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention is one of 2 things I wanted to mention is that the SSDs, this is a M.2 type SSD. As you can see, it's just a very thin board. I'm going to actually remove it so you can take a better look. Okay, so it looks like this. Now, one thing that I do advise you to do if you do use an SSD with your Raspberry Pi is to ensure that you put some sort of cooling on it. So I had a spare cooler lying around, so I used it to attach it onto this SSD because it does get hot and it is enclosed in a pretty much almost airtight area inside the board with no access to the fan and a cooling tower. So this part does not come in the SoundFounder Pironman box. So I do advise you to purchase this separately and stick it onto your SSD board. And while we're still here, you can see there's a couple of additional RGB LEDs down the bottom. All right, so I'm going to put that back on the board, the daughter board, and push it in to make contact and tighten the SSD in place. Okay. Double check the spaces. All good. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention, so this is the second thing that I should mention, is that the length of the two wires for the fan is just not long enough. So the fan needs to connect to these two pins. So from the back of the enclosure to the front of the enclosure, I consider this to be the front of the enclosure because I can access the GPIOs. So the wires that come out of the fan are just not long enough. So you need to provide an extension and a couple of extra jumper wires. You can see my solution here, a couple of extra jumper wires to provide an extension. This is a male to a female at the other end will provide you with the required length for the fan. All right, so that's it. I'm going to put the enclosure back together and then turn it on. So I have reassembled my Raspberry Pi enclosure and I'm going to connect it to power, network, and turn it on. So let's start with power. So got my power cable here. This is a Raspberry Pi power supply. So I'll plug it into the daughter board down here. Got network, plug it into the Raspberry Pi. I'm using both the Ethernet network adapter and Wi-Fi for this particular Raspberry Pi, so I've got access through the two different interfaces. All right, and to turn it on, just press the power button. You can see activity, the activity LED on the Raspberry Pi, and the memory down here, SSD, so it's putting off the SSD. Give it a few seconds to start up and the display should light up. There you go. With some information about the status. So the information that you get here is CPU, activity, the temperature, 29.7 degrees right now. RAM, got 1 gigabyte RAM Raspberry Pi 4. So very little of that is being taken up, 0.1 gigabytes. And ROM, meaning the SSD, so 118 gigabytes total size, just 1.9 being used right now. So I've got the light version of the Raspberry Pi OS. So Raspberry Pi is up. Now the fan is configurable. You can set it to start at whichever degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit you want. I've set mine to start up at 50 degrees Celsius. I'm now looking at the temperature gauge here, and yeah, since the Raspberry Pi started, originally it was about 20 degrees. Room temperature is now rising to 33 degrees. It's around here. So once it hits 50 degrees, the fan will start and it will push air from this side to the other side and cool down the processor. During the operation, the LED as well, you can see the RGB LEDs just change. The color is also configurable. I'll show you how to do that in a moment once we get to the computer. And that's about it. If you want to turn it off, you don't need to go to the command line. You can just press the button and hold it, power off, and it's off. All right. I'll turn it back on and let's go over to my computer to show you some basics on how you can set up your Pironman, how to do configuration, and where to get more information, including assembly. Now that I have reassembled my new Pironman enclosure and turned on the Raspberry Pi in it, let's have a look at some of the details and the documentation on the SoundFounder website. So first of all, as you can see, my Raspberry Pi is up and running. I've already logged into it and I've just ran the fdiskl command just to have a look at the file system. And there's my SDA device with 120 gigabytes. This is the SD card, and it feels obviously much faster than the file system on an SD card. It's now starting to feel like a normal computer, like a desktop computer. And obviously that has to do with the performance of an SSD. This is just a SATA SSD, but still it's an order of magnitude faster than an SD card, even though it's going through the USB 3 port, which is itself pretty fast anyway. So I'm using this Raspberry Pi with a single gigabyte as a remote computer. I have not connected a keyboard, mouse, or screen to it to try it out as a PC, but it's still a remote server, as most of my Raspberry Pis, I use them as remote servers. But at some point, I plan to connect a screen, keyboard, and mouse, and get a feel of what it is like used as a PC, just to do normal PC things like email and browse the web and a little bit of programming. I'll do that a bit later. Now, I just wanted to show you a few things on the SunFounder website, at the Pironman enclosure product page and the documentation. Just point out a few things here on the documentation. First thing to notice is that when you purchase one of these cases, what's in the box are all the bits and pieces that you need in order to put together the enclosure. The enclosure comes partially assembled, but then you actually need to disassemble it in order to make everything fit and then put it back together again. It just ships assembled, I guess, because it is a nice rectangular box. It fits better in the box instead of having the parts loose. Everything that you need is in the box, except of course the Raspberry Pi and a power supply. You need to provide those yourself. Oh yes, as well, an SSD. An SSD is not included. The only other thing that you need to provide, as I showed you earlier, is just a couple of extension jumper wires for the fan, so that the fan can connect to the fan pins on the daughter board. All right, all the documentation that you need is here, starting with the assembly instructions. This is an electronic copy of the printed instructions that come with the box. So in case you lose the printed instructions, you can find the PDF right here. Just follow the steps one by one. It's all here. I didn't actually get stuck anywhere. I felt that the instructions with the visuals and the little bit of text were very clear, very easy to follow. Even the tools that you need, like the screwdriver and the cross wrench for the spaces is supplied, which is great. All right, next, let's go back one step. Next, the Raspberry Pi OS, nothing special about this. Just use the Raspberry Pi imager to install the Raspberry Pi operating system on an SD card to begin with. And then there's instructions further down on how to migrate your SD card onto the SSD. So you can do that. I'll show you how to do that a little later. I am running the mini version of the Raspberry Pi OS 32-bit. I normally don't need the desktop, but as I said, it's probably something I'm going to try a bit later. I go for the minimal version. So just follow the instructions. Again, nothing fancy here, just regular Raspberry Pi operating system installation. Now the next thing is, let's go to step 5, is to set up Pironman, meaning set up the module. There's a Python module that controls the screen and a couple of other operations, such as the behavior of the power button and the RGB LEDs. So there's easy to follow instructions. There's a configuration file, and you need to put a couple of new lines of code in here. And then the Pironman module itself, which is easy to install. You first clone it and then use Python 3 to install this module. Once the module is installed, it starts to operate automatically. The OLED screen will light up and you start seeing the CPU load, the memory load, how much space is taken up on the SD card or on the SSD, whichever is being used, and the temperature of the CPU. You can also use the utility to configure those operations. So for example, you can configure how long the OLED display should stay lit, after which time it turns off, just to save itself, save burning text on it or graphics. When the fan should start up, you can configure the color of the RGB strip, and then how you'd like the power button to behave. So if you press the power button for 2 seconds at least, then it will do a graceful shutdown. So it will actually issue the shutdown command and turn off. Or if that method doesn't work, perhaps the Raspberry Pi has frozen for some reason, you can hold that button down for 10 seconds and it will forcibly shut down the Raspberry Pi. You can use Pironman C, the C switch, to check your current settings. So these are my current settings. And then you can also use Pironman module with other commands that you can find here to change those settings. So you can change, for example, the screen off time to 180 seconds, or set the color for the RGB strip, and so on. There's also a text file here that you can use right here. So you can make all of those changes in the configuration file directly instead of via the command line. All right. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is the SSD. So you go into section 6, the M.2 SSD. This is where you can find instructions on how to install your SSD. I showed you this a bit earlier in my enclosure. This is an M.2 type SSD, and it can be full length as well. I believe this is a 2280 length SSD, or you can install shorter ones as well. You can see here there are screw holes that allow you to secure shorter M.2 SSDs in there. Now, the other thing that doesn't come with the box that I do recommend that you do is to attach a cooling device on the SSD chip itself, because these can get hot and shorten the lifespan of the SSD. As I showed you earlier in the video, I attached a CPU cooler on top of the chip on the top side of my SSD. My SSD board only contained one chip, so I just put one cooler up the top right there to at least lower the temperature a little bit during operation. So that will improve the longevity of the SSD. Okay, so once you install your SSD, you can reboot your Raspberry Pi, and there are instructions down here on how to do the migration, move essentially the operating system from the SD card to the SSD. And there's the instructions right here. This is exactly the set of instructions that I followed. It worked out the first time really well. And there was just one more thing actually that you had to do. It's because you are migrating a 32 gigabyte SD card into, in my case, a 128 gigabyte disk or SSD, you needed to do one more little thing in order to expand the file system to take over the entire available space on the SSD. And that is to use Raspi config and go to advanced options and just choose A1, basically expand the file system. In my case, it won't make any difference because it's already expanded. So I'm just going to say finish and do not reboot. But when you do that, your SSD will be fully utilized, and then you'll be able to get to work. So all in all, I'm really happy with this enclosure. It's something that has really improved the way that I approach the Raspberry Pi. Now it's starting to feel more like a real computer than something that I'm experimenting with. I will be spending more time with the Raspberry Pi and see what it feels like to use it as a real computer on my desktop, connected to a mouse, a screen, and a keyboard, and start using it for normal PC stuff like browsing the internet for information and doing email, and see how it behaves under that kind of load. Okay, so I'll end it here. I hope that you enjoyed this review of the Raspberry Pi Sun Founder Pironman enclosure. And of course, if you have any questions or comments to make, please feel free to do so in the comments below.